Soon arriving in Paris, one of the more beautiful fountains in the heart of town. A view of the Pantheon looking up Rue Soufflot, and another one of my favorite fountains in the Place des Vosges in the Marais, which is nearly 300 years old, where we're treated to a beautiful musical interlude. Throughout Europe, you're going to find street musicians like this. They call them buskers in London. They'll perform perhaps solo, they might perform as a group or as a combo. Coming up in a few minutes, we'll treat you to some bongo drums. The Place de la Concorde is right in the heart of town. It's the largest square in all of Europe, and these fountains are also among the most beautiful in Paris. Made famous by Gene Kelly in the movie An American in Paris, where he did some pretty hot dancing. And now we skip over to the gardens of the Palais Royal, another one of the real beauty spots in Paris. It's kind of hidden away. You might not even notice it from the street. You have to walk through some arcades. It's over near the Louvre Museum, and it's well worth a visit to the Palais Royal. There's arcades, there's the garden and benches and fountains. We are skipping around town here to show you some of the most attractive visual highlights of Paris. Now we find ourselves in the Ile Saint-Louis, which is right in the middle of the River Seine. It's like a small village in the heart of the big city. And then just across the river, we find ourselves in the left bank, which continues this small village atmosphere with the little vest pocket parks. And there's many narrow, quiet streets here. And one of the more interesting walks is to be had along the banks of the River Seine here on the left bank. It's walking right along the quay of the river with a great view of Notre Dame in the background. This is part of our typical walking tour that we conduct right through the heart of old Paris on our visit to the city. Notre Dame, the classic Gothic towers. And you want to take a look inside these churches, of course, instead of walking by on the outside, and you might find yourself surprised by a musical concert. A number of churches have formal concerts in the evening for which you pay admission, typically $10. In this case, we were lucky in the afternoon to run into the rehearsal. It was free and casual. That was the Church of Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, and it's right here in the heart of the Latin Quarter, a great place to get a cheap lunch. The Greek restaurants along Rue Houchet are one of the best deals in town, and you can get your fresh baguette while you're at it, a loaf of French bread. A typical Greek sandwich will cost you about $4.50, and it comes complete with French fries. This neighborhood is just one of the most interesting for a variety of restaurants. And then crossing Boulevard Saint-Michel, we're starting to head down Rue de Bussy, one of our favorite streets for just strolling along, closed to cars, mostly for pedestrians and bicycles. We've just seen some of the more interesting streets that the left bank has to offer. Now we're crossing back over the River Seine to the right bank. This Brasserie La Pyramide was very popular with our travelers. It's just across the street from the Saint-Martin department store. We're in the neighborhood of Les Halles, which is where our hotel is located. We're staying at the Novotel Paris Les Halles. Great location. This neighborhood around Les Halles is also for pedestrians. They claim it's the largest pedestrian mall area in all of Europe. It goes for about 10 blocks in every direction, and it's the ultimate place for sidewalk cafes in Paris. It's busy during the day for lunch and afternoon cocktails, and then it's even more busy in the evening. It gets really lively as the lights go down. The Stravinsky Fountains in the neighborhood is one of the more whimsical treats right next to the Pompidou Center. The ultra-modern Pavilion of Les Halles is an underground shopping center with 150 stores. The avant-garde circus atmosphere contrasts with the towering Gothic Church of Saint Eustace. Well, you might not pay to watch such a concert, but you don't have to pay because it's just out on the sidewalks here, part of the street theater of Les Halles in the heart of Paris. The Fountain of the Innocents is a Renaissance fountain that dates back to the 1550s. beautifully restored at the centerpiece of the neighborhood. There's a lot of fast food restaurants here, and there's some special little restaurants, there's some piano bars, and there's a few gourmet restaurants tucked away here and there. You really have to know what you're looking for when you go to get a meal in this part of Paris, because you might end up just with a mediocre meal or with something that's truly gastronomic. You'll find a tremendous variety of ethnic foods. There's Japanese, there's Chinese, there's Italian, there's Mexican, there's a Cuban restaurant, soul food from Africa. The world is your oyster here, and yes, there's plenty of fresh seafood as well. You see how some of these sidewalk restaurants deal with the cool spring weather. They've got their glass walls up and their awnings. In the summertime, it would be a little bit more open air, and in the middle of winter, they would retreat to the interior of the restaurants. But here we are in April in the evening, and it's very pleasant indeed. We found a great little French bistro where the waiters didn't even speak any English, but we were able to communicate enough to get a great meal. And the next morning, we're now heading out to one of the most interesting mornings of the entire tour, because we're going to go pay a visit to the Louvre Museum. It's just a few blocks from our hotel, so we walk on over and enter through the modern underground shopping mall, and one of the first objects that we see is Michelangelo's slaves. You might recall earlier when we were in Florence, we saw the unfinished version of Michelangelo's slaves at the Hall of David in the Accademia. The most famous work of art in the world is here. Oh yes, everybody comes in flocks to see the Mona Lisa and the Winged Victory and Venus de Milo. Those are the holy trinity of the Louvre Museum, but there are of course thousands more objects to see inside the Louvre. It's become the world's largest museum of fine arts. There's that Winged Victory, and we'll show you Venus in just a moment. The Louvre has got a vast, comprehensive collection that spans the entire reach of human culture. The building alone is a great work of art. Just look at these ceilings, and the hallways, the floors. Not to mention the collection. We have some ancient Greek and Roman statues that lead up in a side gallery, which I would suggest you take instead of walking down the main hallway towards the Venus de Milo. Take a right and go through this little detour of an interesting side gallery of classical statues, and then you can sneak up on the Venus from behind. It's always quite crowded here in front of this incredible statue, the embodiment of the female ideal as seen in ancient Greece in 500 BC. 2,500 years ago, and 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians were carving similar great works, the Sphinx. In all of my travels, the most elaborate interior decor I've ever seen is right here. It's the halls of Napoleon III. These were done in the 1850s through 1870s, and it's part of the Louvre Museum that was just recently reopened to the public. For most of this century, it had been the private offices of the French Ministry of Finance. The head bankers were sitting here enjoying this splendor all to themselves. They had their own private dining room, and they refused to move out until finally they were budged by Mitterrand and his grand projects of expanding the scope of the Louvre Museum to include this Richelieu wing of the museum, which has nearly doubled the size altogether of the inventory of the Louvre Museum. There are many Rembrandts on display, including his self-portraits, Queen of Bathsheba. There's Vermeers, Van Eyck's, an entire gallery filled with large paintings by Rubens. We usually spend about 3 hours inside visiting the collections, which is enough to give you a very good taste, but now it's time to go and move along in our program, exiting out this controversial and spectacular glass pyramid with its spiral staircase. One of the hidden gems of the Latin Quarter is this amazing church called Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. It's constructed in a combination of late Gothic and early Renaissance style. Notice on the right side the Renaissance doorway, and in the center that spiral staircase. That's part of the rood screen that goes across the altar. Formerly, all the churches in Paris had a rood screen, but this is the only one left. for they were taken down in the Reformation. The ambulatory behind the altar has a spectacular set of stained glass windows and a stunning collection of columns and Gothic fan vaulting. This church is just a miraculous blend of the late Gothic and the Renaissance. It's a transitional church architecturally, and it shows how the Gothic style of architecture persisted for hundreds of years. The Gothic style was born here in Paris with the founding of Notre Dame and Saint-Denis back around the year 1200. Well, this is constructed in the year 1500, 300 years later, and yet the Gothic style has continued with considerable elaboration. Notice how light and airy it looks inside, with the large windows and the thin, graceful pillars, very much typical of the Renaissance. Again, another view of the rood screen. The geometry and the tracery and the spirals and the architecture are one of the most amazing sights that you'll see in Paris. You must stop by Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. It's right behind the big church of the Pantheon in the Latin Quarter. And you'll notice midway up the columns there's a banister and a railing that's actually a walkway up there. Not for the public to walk on, but the public is certainly invited to come on in and have a look at this great church, which also has a most beautiful facade. Again, a mix of the Gothic and the Renaissance. From here we go right down the street to the bottom of Rue Soufflot to the Luxembourg Gardens. These terraces are landscaped in the formal French manner. Sculptures are scattered here and there. There are benches to sit down on and relax. There's fountains, flower beds, and there's the palace. The Palais du Luxembourg is the centerpiece of the gardens. It was originally built as a home for Marie de Medici, who had come up from Florence to marry King Henry IV. Henry IV died, and Marie de Medici got involved in a power struggle opposing Richelieu, and she lost, and she was banished from Paris. The tragedy was the palace was finished in 1631, but she never got to live in the palace because she had been kicked out of town. As our guide is telling us as we walk along together through the gardens, it's a charming spot, and the neighborhoods all around it have a mix of residential and commercial. There's cafes, there's some very expensive apartments on one side and a lot of government offices as well. Today that palace is the home of the French Senate. And you'll find this fabulous pastry shop, Daloyot, just by the fountains at the foot of Rue Soufflot, at the entrance to the Luxembourg Gardens. Daloyot has several other branches in town, and of course you'll find a patisserie on nearly every street in the city. One of the great pleasures of France, the delicious pastries. So we stop in for a bite and refresh ourselves, use the facilities, and then we're on our way, passing once again this spectacular fountain at the foot of Rue Soufflot, looking up the Pantheon, a neoclassical style building with that Renaissance dome. We've finished our city tour, just showing you some highlights. There's a lot more to it on the half-day city tour, of course, but for World Traveler, we're just bringing you the best of the best. And here is one of the great brasseries in town. It's Le Grand Colbert. Fine dining here in the heart of Paris. It's just behind the Palais Royal in the Galerie Colbert, part of the Galerie Vivienne as well. A real classic bistro. This gallery is typical of about a dozen such galleries that are found throughout Paris. It's an indoor shopping mall that dates back to the late 19th century. Just like today we have covered shopping malls, we thought we had invented something new in the modern age, but no, they really got their start here in Paris over 100 years ago. And it makes sense. It keeps the rain out, lets the light in.
The same mist coming
in fact,
down.
Today is a slightly misty day. There's a very light drizzle on and off, so let's head down into the underworld and go by metro. What a great system for getting around the city. The Paris Metro has 18 different lines. They all interconnect so that you can go anywhere with one change of train or maybe two change of train if it's an elaborate itinerary. You can get from one side of Paris to the other in 15 minutes. We're coming up at Abbesse with this Art Nouveau glass awning by Guimard. We're heading up to Montmartre. No, we don't have to climb the steps because look to the left, there's a funicular that took us up. The steps are quite charming though. You might want to walk down the stairs when you're finished with your visit to Montmartre. We're at the top of the hill overlooking the city. One of the most classic views of Paris. It hasn't changed in 150 years. The Place du Tertre at twilight. There can't be much finer in the world. So we decided to have dinner, and all the restaurants were full on the inside, so we sat outside. Yes, it's April, and it was a little cool, a little nippy even, but they've got gas heaters. Notice those tall mushroom-shaped fixtures there in the midst of the diners. Watch this waiter pile up all the soups, and he's heading for our table with this hot onion soup. Let's just follow him along as he weaves his way through the tables with that skillful Parisian flair. And we'll show you a little bit more of this outdoor dining scene in the evening in April, heated by those gas burners. It was a really great experience. The food was quite good, the atmosphere superb, and we're all together for our final night in Paris. We've had 3 nights in Paris on our tour with World Traveler. We started in Rome, went to Florence, then Venice, Lucerne, 3 nights in Paris, and we're heading for London, our next destination.